So this is, in fact, a massively tall order to convey everything that I want to convey in the next 40 minutes or so. So I'll do the best I can. But I deliberately don't want to take it too fast, because the whole purpose of this session is that it is a back to basics, and it's really aimed at people that have not worked in this area in much depth before. So the topics that I'd like to cover are shown here. Probably will only get through the first 7 or 8. We'll just see how it goes. Those of you that know this very well, feel free to chip in if I say something controversial or is plain wrong. I don't ever profess to know absolutely everything and be 100% accurate, but I hope that this presentation is fairly accurate. For questions, I think I'm reasonably happy to take them as they come, and I'll rely on whoever's looking after me in the chat to just interrupt me, because I don't think I'll be able to keep my eye on the chat as well as talking to the presentation.
Imtiaz is doing that, but we'll all keep an eye on it.
Yeah. I'm very happy. I much prefer to have it interactive. So, okay. So that's me. I'm not going to say too much. Freelance consultant. I've been doing this for probably far too long now. Maybe I should have a different career, but no. Seriously, the whole thing about dynamics is that it's just evolving at a ridiculous rate now. It is just continually fascinating to see all the new stuff. And anyway, there's some contact details there if you want to reach out to me afterwards. I think we've already talked about that. I might prompt people for questions if nothing's coming. So feel free. Don't be afraid to ask, because the chances are if you ask something, everyone else will think, oh, I'm glad they asked that, because I was too embarrassed to myself. This is being recorded, as Andrew explained, but actually I already did this presentation for the London meeting on April at the end of last month, and I believe that recording already is on YouTube, so you might want to compare the two and see which one's better for you. Right, so let's get straight into it. So we're talking about security, and the first area I want to cover is about users and how they get their privileges to do something, which of course is using security roles. So let's just think very, very quickly about the purpose of the security model. And I guess for most people, it's all about having access to records. What is it that users can see in the various apps that we have, and what can they do with those records? But we also can think about features which are not really specific to any particular record type. So for example, you can export to Excel, and that's something you can just do. It's nothing to do with exporting to Excel only accounts or only contacts. It's a general feature that applies across the board, and there are quite a few of those. And then the security model also has a role to play in controlling access to different types of forms and dashboards and so on. And I'll talk a little bit about that if I get time. But principally, we're talking about access to data. And what else? Well, I think of old, before we had the concept of apps, the user interface was really quite good at hiding things, entities and features and commands that you weren't allowed to do. So for example, if you didn't have the delete privilege, then you wouldn't see the delete button. If you weren't allowed to work with orders, then you wouldn't see orders in the interface. So one way of simplifying the user experience was to be a bit clever with what you allowed people to do in the security model, in their security roles. But of course, now that we have all these apps, that's a much simpler way of providing people with a tailored user interface. But don't forget that security roles will still play a part here in controlling what people can see. Now, I think almost everything that I'm going to say works for on-premises and online, and if there is something that doesn't, I'll try and remember to tell you. So anyone that's going to work with Dynamics must have an account. For online, it is of course an Office 365 work account, which is actually in Azure Active Directory, and for on-premises, it's an Active Directory user account. Any interactive access to Dynamics must be by someone that has authenticated. There are other ways of interacting with the product for integration scenarios, but I'm not going to go there. So you must have a user account. Did somebody say something just then? No. So anything that somebody does will be logged against that user account. So if somebody creates a record, we know who created it. Somebody makes a change to a record, we know who changed it. And if auditing is switched on, then that user who is connected doing whatever it is they're doing will have their name against whatever happened in the audit log. Now, the way a user gains the rights to do something is through security roles, and those security roles will specify what they can do, and they can be assigned. I say they because a person can have one or more security roles directly to the user record, and also, maybe optionally also, assigned to teams that the user belongs to, and a user can belong to multiple teams. And in terms of a permission, we need to think about two things, I think, generally. Something that you can do, which I'm calling a privilege, like view a record, delete a record, make a change to a record, and an access level. And that would be which records are you allowed to perform that privilege on. And then we also have these specific task-based permissions like export to Excel and so on. Now, users must have at least one security role to log in and use Dynamics 365. And of old, it had to be directly assigned to the user. But that's not strictly true anymore, because it is possible for users to not have any security roles assigned to them, and they gain the security roles through teams that they belong to. But that's a relatively recent change. So of old, that would have been true. But however they get their security roles, they must have at least one. So in managing the security roles, if you think about the number of entities that you have in an instance that's got, sales and service apps, there are a lot of entities there. There are a lot of privileges. And if you think of the combinations, there's an awful lot to configure from scratch. And if we have a look in the security area, and I'm going to do this in the old interface because doing it in the Power Platform kind of takes you to the same place. So let me just very quickly show you what I mean. So in the classic interface, we navigate to security roles, and we have a list about security roles. If I go to the admin Power Platform and go to the settings area, there is the security roles, and all it does is pops up another tab with a similar looking list. So I won't bother with that for the moment. So we have a load of out-of-the-box security roles. This list will vary depending on any solutions you may have installed. So there are quite a few that go by job name, and the more important, of course, the job sounds, the more privileges that person will have. Some apps will add in additional ones that are more feature related. So in sales, we have these playbook roles and forecast roles and so on. So you can use those out-of-the-box roles exactly as they come, or you can make changes to them, or you can copy one of those roles and make changes to it, or you can create a brand new role. But if you do that, you'll end up with something that's got nothing in it. So if I click new here, you'll find a role and a load of empty circles, and you've got to spend there with your coloring pencil deciding what the privilege should be for every single combination. Now, there is a place for creating an empty role, which I'll come to later, but I think more often than not, I would say let's take one that looks like it's what we want and then do something like this, more actions. Copy the role, give it a name that makes sense to to your business. So this is the company, my company name, like that, and then click OK. So leave the out-of-the-box roles alone, make copies for yourself, and then do whatever you want with them, and use those. Let's move that away as well. Now, the one thing where that caused me a problem, actually, where I copied a role and edited it, was where Microsoft introduced a new privilege. So I had made a copy of this system customizer role, and then all of a sudden they couldn't do something, and I had to log it with Microsoft and found that there was a privilege that the person didn't have, which stopped them doing something in form design. So just watch out for that if you make a copy of an out-of-the-box security role. You know, if new entities appear, then you're going to have to deal with updating your copy. Right. Okay. So let's go on to privileges. So privileges define what the user can do on an entity. So, you know, for example, can you create contacts? Can you read accounts, and so on? Now, for write, which is the wording that's used, it means exactly the same as change, modify, update, whichever word you want to that you like. Here's the full list. I think most of them are self-explanatory. Having delivered training on this loads and loads and loads of times, I think it's Append and Append 2 that people have any confusion with, if they're going to be confused by any of it. So can you create records? Can you view records? Can you change data in a record? Can you delete records? Assign means can you make someone else the owner of a record? So all records have an owner, but with some exceptions. And sharing is where somebody says, I'd like you to have access to a record because you're not allowed to, but I know you need to, so I can share it to you. But that can only happen if the person has the share privilege. And Append and Append 2 I'll come to in a minute. It's to do with linking records to each other. So we've all seen yellow sticky notes. You've seen the notes feature on a record. So let's say we have our contact record and we create a note against the contact record. So with all the out-of-the-box security roles, all the privileges that you need to do that are already there by default. But if you're thinking about this for, say, custom entities, it's something you're going to have to think about. So to allow someone to create a note and connect it to a contact record, 2 privileges are required. On the note entity, they need the privilege to append, which means I can take this note and stick it on other records. And the record I want to stick this note on to, I need the append to privilege on that record. So in this case, it's append for note and append to for contact. So that's what those 2 mean. And you need to have the pair. So it's quite possible to set up a scenario where people can create notes and link them to contacts, accounts, and what have you, but not maybe cases. So you may have some weird scenario like that. So when we look at a security role, so here is the one that I made a copy of. We've got to think about these colored circles, and they're divided, the entities are divided over a number of tabs, and lots of these will make sense. Some of them I have no idea what they're for, so I leave them alone. I'm still waiting for an answer on what missing entities is all about. If anybody knows, I will be delighted to know. And so anyway, so here's, say, the account. Here are the privileges, and the circle here with the color tells you the level or the scope that the person has, and I'm going to explain that in just a moment. And then as you look on the other tabs, you'll see things to do with marketing. That's not the current marketing, that's the old marketing, the simplistic marketing capability that was is in sales. Forget these 2, these are antique things that never ever appeared outside of America, and so on. And then here are your miscellaneous privileges, okay, and so on. And as we move on to customization, you're more into things that more an administrator customizer might do, and so on. Okay, so let's talk about scope of privilege. So a user is allowed to make changes to an account record, but which ones are they allowed to modify? Well, in order to answer that and to explain the access level, we have to consider business units. So let's go and have a look at business units. So what is a business unit? You might like to think of it as a security boundary because it contains users and teams and, in fact, security roles. You might think it's a bit like a department in a business, but not necessarily. The purpose of having additional business units is really, I think, around security. You could say it's also for reporting. Now, when the system is first set up, there will be exactly one business unit. So I've got a trial here called FK April 20, and there is the root business unit that was added. I know it's the root because it's the only one there that hasn't got a parent. And I've added some 2 child business units. And so that means when I add users to this instance, I can choose to put them in any of those 3 business units. Okay. So when we add one user, they can only belong to the one business unit. They can be moved around if they change job or whatever. Little summary of what you can do with your business unit. So once you've added them, you can rename them and get rid of them. But just one thing about getting rid of a business unit. So if I take this one and click delete, that's going to fail because it says I have to disable it first. And so just look in there, more actions, disable the business unit. So it's disappeared. Look for your inactive ones, and then the that delete will work unless I happen to have some users in there. Yeah, there are some users in there, so I'd have to go and find the users. Notice how we still have bits of antique user interface here. So we'd have to find some users, so that user would have to be moved into a different business unit, and then I could delete it. If you're not sure that you need a business unit, then don't create one. Just stick with the single root until you have a justifiable need to create additional business units. Now, I have seen some ridiculous structures where you think, oh my God, that's too complicated. In terms of hierarchy, as far as I know, the number of levels you can have is as much as you want. Anyway, let's come back to this access level in a security role. Which records can a user modify? And we have to look at the color of the circle because that's what it's all about. And to answer that question, we have to think about who owns the record that the user is trying to do something to, and which business unit does the owner belong to, and which business unit does the user belong to. And just to make things even more interesting, there is also sharing, but let's ignore that for a moment.
I've got a question from Joe. It says, can a user in a disabled business unit still log into the application?
No.
Thank you.
As far as I know, I mean, that's yeah, I'm sure that's correct. Yeah. So in online, they can only become disabled if you remove their license. So they would definitely not be able to log on. In on-prem, it's something you can click on their user record and disable them. Okay, so the access levels, we have these 5, and the color of the circle is used to reflect that. If you're a programmer, you might see different wording. There's, I think it's called none, basic, local, deep, and global, but let's not worry too much about that. So let's just go through what each of those 5 levels mean. So none is fairly simple. The user cannot exercise that privilege for any records of the given entity, even if they own the record. So just because you own the record doesn't mean you can do anything to that record. And if somebody shares a record to you, you still can't use the privilege. The none is kind of a blocking one. Then we go up one level to user level. So let's say we're talking about read on opportunities, then you can read any opportunities that you own and any that are shared to you. Okay. Now, if you go up to business unit, then as well as everything that you get with the user level, then you can also use that privilege for any records that are owned by people in the same business unit as you, or shared to anybody in the same business unit as you, as well as ones that are shared to you and ones that you own. So you're getting a bit more of a departmental, if I can put it like that, responsibility for things. And then we can extend that, to the next level, which is called parent-child. The parent, I think, is slightly confusing because it starts with the business unit that you belong to and looks all the way down through child business units. So as well as the other levels, you can do whatever it is that we're talking about to records that are owned by people in the same business unit as you and any business unit owned by people in any business unit below your one. And then the final one, organization, very straightforward. It doesn't matter who owns the record. You can do whatever it is, regardless of the owner. And this is, of course, less work for the platform to sort out, because if it sees you've got org level permission, it then doesn't have to go and find out who you are and who owns the record. Now, if you imagine a scenario where there's only one business unit, then those last three levels of organization, parent, child, and business unit amount to effectively the same thing, because there's only the one business unit. But don't use that when planning your security model. Think about the fact that you might end up adding more later, because you don't really want to revisit it if you don't have to. Now, in the same way that users belong to a business unit, so do security roles, because when you add a role to a business unit, it's automatically made available in all child business units, but you can add roles to any business unit you like. So if I go over here and say, let's have a look at security roles, and say switch the business unit to the sales one, and then say new, then the common trap is that you think you're creating a new security role in sales, but you're not, because even though it says sales there, it's defaulted to the root. So you still have to come here and say, let's switch to sales. So I would be creating this role in the sales business unit. So let's just call it sales role number 2, and click save and close. I didn't configure anything on it, but that's not the point here. So if I go to FK April, there is no sales number 2, but if I go to sales, there's my sales role 2. Now, the point of that is that a user can only be given roles that exist in their business unit. So if I were to add people to the sales business unit, they could have any of these roles. But if I was to add someone to the FK April business unit, they wouldn't be able to have that sales number 2 role. Okay, now, one of the things that Dynamics does is that if you create a role, it automatically makes it visible in all child business units, so that it can be used in any of the business units. And if I was to put one here at this level, that one would be available there, but not in the rest of the tree. Now, one thing that I would say to you is probably consider creating roles only in the root, because A, it keeps it simple, and you don't get confused about where did you create the role and how do I deal with it. Because if you look at a role in a child business unit like this one, you'll see that it says it's an inherited role and you can't change it. And the only place you can change it is to go to the business unit where it was defined and make the change there. Now, annoyingly, although you can't change it, the interface still lets you click on the circle. So if you miss that and spend 30 minutes clicking all these circles and then look for the save button, you think, oh God, I've just wasted half an hour. So you're kind of stuck there. So, and then the other reason for only putting them in the root business unit is that if you want to move your security roles in a solution to get them from one instance to another, only the roles in the root BU can be added to a solution. And I think the reason for that is that if you were to add them from lower down BUs, that lower down BU might not exist in the destination where you're going to move your security role to. So another reason for keeping things all at the root, even though it's possible to put them elsewhere. Do you think you can have two security roles with the same name in the same business unit? Anybody want to have a stab at that question? Simple yes or no will do.
It's a trap.
Well, no, it's not, because there is a yes or a no answer to it.
I'd say no.
Okay, well, you can. But it's a little slightly contrived. You create the name in the business you create one in a business unit, and then you create another one with the same name in a higher business unit, and then you get it inherited down, and you end up with two the same. I won't demo this in the interest of time, but it is possible. But again, another reason for keeping everything at the root. Managing roles, several ways you can do it in terms of, a couple of things I want to show you in terms of fiddling with a role. So let's have a look here. So let's go over to, let's say you want to work with the account entity. So as you click here, you'll see that it just toggles through the levels. But if you click the word account, it toggles the entire line. And similarly, if you click delete, it does the whole thing there as well and takes you through the whole thing. You may ask why there are some gaps. So for some entities, some of the privileges are not relevant. And another one, product, doesn't have assign and share. And that's because it's organization owned. When you create your own entities, a choice you have to make is the entity going to be user or team owned? So it's not a choice user or team, that's the wording, user or team, that's a single thing, or organization owned. Organization owned entities do not have the 5 levels. It's just you have access or you don't. And because they don't have an owner, then assign and share are just not relevant. But I'm probably going to mention that in a couple of slides' time as well. Giving people a privilege, security role, several ways you can do it. Find their record, and so just grab a couple of people, and then you can do manage roles like that. Now, because I've selected 2 people, then the only thing I can do is give them extra roles. So regardless of what they have now, if I select that, they're both going to pick up that role. Or you highlight one user, manage roles, and then you get to see all the roles they have. Or you can go onto their record and do the same thing. You'll get the manage roles button appear on there. Or you can click on the related items or the related tab in the unified interface, go to security roles, and then you'll see a list of the roles that they have. And then you can use manage roles there. While you're on a list of users, there is an out-of-the-box report, if I can find it. Where is? Oh, there it is. That does a summary of what roles everybody has. I suppose it's kind of useful as a reference, but if you really want to manage roles and you've got thousands of users and thousands of roles, use all the little tools that are in the XRM toolbox. There are several free contributed tools for managing security in there. Right, okay. If you move somebody to a different business unit, then they are still the owner of all their records, but they will have no security roles until you as an administrator give them new ones. Because Dynamics says, well, hang on a minute, you're moving this person to a new BU. The roles that they have already might not be available in the new BU. You're probably giving them a new job, so you decide what they should have. But the records that they own will still be owned by them. And as a result of moving that person to a new BU, that might affect who has access to their records, depending on what the security roles of someone else is. Because if user A and user B and they're in the same BU and you take user A out of that BU and user B has only got business unit access to records, then user B can no longer see user A's records. So, you know, there are all sorts of possibilities there to confuse people. Another thing that I find people saying is, oh, I must put myself in the root because that's the most important one. Well, not true. Nothing special about the root. Giving you more privileges. You know, somebody in the lowest possible BU could be have far more privileges than someone in the root, again, depending on how you configure things. A couple of special roles. Administrator, by definition, can do anything, with a very, very few exceptions around personal views, which is really annoying, but anyway, that's another story. And then there's another role which I think people tend not to use, called System Customizer. And the idea here is that a customizer can do customizations, but only see their own records, whereas an administrator can see all records that I talked about. Let's go on to teams. So teams contain users. They can't contain teams. A team can only be in one business unit, just like a user, but a useful feature is that the members of the team can come from anywhere. So we've got a team here, team A and user A and user B, but user A actually is from a different BU. And that could be useful in a scenario which I'm going to come to. But let's have a look at different types of teams first. So up until probably towards the end of last year, we had two types of teams, owner teams and access teams. Owner teams could own the records, access teams couldn't. But towards the end of last year, a couple of other types of teams were introduced in online. Azure Active Directory teams, one linked to security groups and one linked to Office groups. And the idea behind those two AAD ones is so that membership of the teams could be managed outside of Dynamics by maybe an Office 365 admin person. So all the management of those teams had to be done outside of Dynamics. Okay, so if a team's going to own a record, it must also have a security role. You can't own a record if you don't have a role that gives you the rights to that record. So and anybody that's part of the team will get all the privileges through their own security roles, plus all of the privileges of all of the teams that they belong to. So they're all combined and the user gets the most generous access level. Even if the user has a non-setting for something, that doesn't prevent them from getting the privilege through other roles in teams that they belong to. So here's a little conundrum that might confuse some, but maybe not others. I've got the manager in the Europe business unit, and the business ask is that they should have access to records in the Europe business unit, but also to records in the USA business unit, but nowhere else. So how would we do that? Well, if we think of the levels, none is no good, user level is no good. If we give the manager business unit level access, okay, then that gives him or her access to the records in his own, but not the USA. And then the next level is organization, which will give access to everything. Well, the answer in this case is to use a team. We create a team in the USA business unit, give it a role that gives it the appropriate privileges, and then put that manager person in the USA business unit team. And you can kind of think of that team as access for people outside of that department, business unit, or guest access, as I call it. And then that would fulfill the business requirement here for the person to have access to records in just two business units, but not the entire thing. Access teams are used for sharing. They can't own records, and if we have time, I'll talk about those later. Azure AD teams, very similar to an owner team. They can own records and can have security roles assigned to them. Two types that correspond directly to the Azure AD group types, and they are effectively dynamically managed as far as someone looking in Dynamics is concerned, because you can't change the membership in Dynamics. It has to happen outside in Azure. Okay, so I think I won't go into that because that'll take too long. So talking about logging in with no roles, if you look at the docs.microsoft.com in this area, this is what it used to say. You must assign at least one security role to every user. The service does not allow access to users who do not have at least one security role. Even if they are a member of a team with its own security privileges, there'll be some issues. It doesn't say that anymore. What it now says is you must assign at least one role to every user, either directly or indirectly, as a member of a team or a group team. So you don't have to give privileges directly to people. This is an error message that you'll see if you try to log in with no roles. This is an enabled user that's got a license but has no roles at all via a team or directly. If you have multiple security roles, you get the most generous. So one of the common problems with security is deciding how to manage it, and how many security roles. So some of the systems I've worked with, I'm ashamed to say, it's a mess, because we never took the time to plan it out. And every time we create new entities, we just think, oh, let's create a new role for that entity. And after a while, it just becomes a nightmare. And what you really want to achieve is, if a new member of staff joins, the answer to what roles should they have should be answerable very simply. And ideally, I think it ought to match the job title that they're doing. You know, you're doing this job, therefore you have these roles. More often than not, it's, oh, give Mary the same roles as Jim's got. Go and have a look at what Jim's got and give Mary the same, because we haven't bothered to plan it or document it. There are lots of different ways of handling this. And I'll just very quickly go through a couple. You could say we're going to have a baseline role that we'll give to everyone. And then we'll do another role that gives them extra privileges. So in this one, everybody gets the baseline. And if you're a salesperson, you get the baseline and the salesperson role. So you get the combination of the two. That's what that's showing. And then you can extend that by giving them a third one if they also happen to be a sales manager. So they get 3 roles. And the benefit of this is that if there's something that everybody in the business needs, you just go and visit one security role, your baseline, and make the change there. Okay. Alternative is to say we're just going to have 1 role per person. So we won't have a baseline. You'll either get the salesperson role or the sales manager role. But if we need to make a change that affects everyone, we're going to have to visit all of the roles and make the change there. You might prefer that, but it's whatever you do, you need to understand what you've done and document it. Other options might be to leverage the fact that users can have roles just through Teams now, and say, let's create teams, put people in the teams and manage the roles there. So reduce the amount of admin of users with roles. But whatever you do, you need to plan it. But I think the best scenario is where you can answer the question easily as to what role someone should have. Okay, let's move on to sharing. So sharing is talking about giving someone else access on a per record basis. So I have a record that I have access to, my colleague doesn't. And my colleague needs it, so that colleague can come to me and say, oh, Feridun, here's some money, I really need this record, please share it to me. But I can only do that if I have the share privilege. And the way to do the sharing, let's just quickly have a look, because I might as well see something since I'm talking an awful lot, is if we go over to here, and so here's a record. If I click share, and we just say add the person that I want to share to, and then I can select the relevant privileges. Now, if this particular user doesn't have a privilege, then I won't be able to select it. Okay. Okay. So there's an example of that. Now, let's move on. Just want to move on a little bit. Just quickly on sharing. If you find lots of people are doing sharing, then it may be that your security model is wrong. And you also have to think about if you want to allow sharing. Okay. Right, hierarchical security is an extension to the. So I wonder if somebody can just confirm to me how much time I've got.
You've got till 8 o'clock.
Oh, cool. Thank you. Okay. So hierarchical security is something that appeared a couple of years back, I think. I'm not super convinced of who it's useful to. So if anybody is using this, I'd be very interested to hear. But anyway, it extends the security model beyond roles by saying we're going to adopt a manager and direct reports type approach here, and say that I'm going to give a manager access to records owned by their staff. Now, their staff we can define in one of 2 ways, and I'll come on to that. And this is in addition to what security roles gives you. And what it will say is that if you switch this on, and it's not on by default, that the manager will have access to records owned by their child users, as well as records that are shared to their child users. But it's slightly different depending on how far away the child users are. So let's look at the two ways that we can define child user. You may have noted on a user record, there's a field called manager. So you can set the manager of a user to another Dynamics user. Okay, so that's one way of defining a manager and child users. And if you do it that way, then for your direct reports, so the people that are directly, for which you are directly the manager, then you have read and update access to their records. And for the direct reports of your direct reports, so we're looking a level away, you only get read access. Now, one of the restrictions for managers, and this is nothing to do with the hierarchy security thing, this has always been the case, to make someone a manager of a user, they have to be in the same business unit as their report or a higher business unit. Now, and there's an example of hierarchy. So Paul is the manager of Patrick. He can have read-write access to Patrick's data. There are Patrick's reports. Paul has read access to Terry, Jim, Nancy's, but Patrick has read-write access, and it goes on and on and on. Okay. Now, an alternative to that is to use what's called a position record, where we now link a user to a position, which is more like a job title, and then users will have access to the records of users in lower positions according to the position hierarchy. And in this case, the manager field isn't relevant. You can still use the manager field, but it's not relevant to the hierarchy security model. Okay. And so this looks like this. We have a position called CEO. We have a position called VP of Sales. And it's the same idea. The CEO has got read-write access to the immediate reports and read access to the indirect reports, and so on. Okay, so in the interface, if I can find the right window to bring across, here we go. And we go to security and positions. So here are your positions. So there I've got the managing director position and the users that have that position. There's user alpha and oh, well, I got that the wrong way around. The parent position is director of sales. That's interesting. Director of sales is the top of the tree and has no parent. Never mind that. And there's user B. User beta is in that. So that's how you set up positions. To switch on hierarchy security, we have a click here. And first you see you have to click the button. I don't quite know why it's got this fancy phrase, hierarchy modeling. I mean, it's called hierarchy security. So there you go. And then you choose whether to use manager or the position. So it's one or t'other. And then this is the depth in terms of how many levels of reports you're going to go down. Okay. Only your immediate level gives you read write. All lower levels give you read. And then there's an extra option to say, we're only going to use this hierarchy security extension on the entities that are in this list. If we want to exclude some, we can select them and then, take them out. So it won't apply to those entities. Okay, so I think the key thing here is you need to switch it on. You've got to decide which method you're going to use, the depth, and whether you want to ignore certain entities. Okay. So has anybody used this out of curiosity? Okay, interesting. I can only think that some large company asked Microsoft to do it, and because they were going to pay them lots of money for licenses, Microsoft said, all right, then we'll do it. Because Microsoft don't really introduce things unless somebody's asked for it. Okay. So they work with security roles. It'll check standard security roles first. And if you don't get the privileges through that, then it will use the entitlements through hierarchy to see if that gives you the rights to do whatever it is you need to do. So it can mean a bit of extra work for the platform if you switch this on. And I think, I can't remember where I found this phrase, probably in the Microsoft documentation. And if the users have got nothing to do with hierarchy, it doesn't affect them. And filtered views will also support the hierarchy security.
Feridun, I've got a question. Yes. Which case would you recommend to create an organization entity? Example, if I create an entity for countries,
yes,
doesn't make much sense to have an owner. What do you think?
Perfect. Absolutely correct. Yes. So organization entities where you don't need the level of the granularity of the intermediate levels, and countries is the example I would normally use. People need to see them or they don't. But the one thing I would say is that if you're not sure, then I would go with the user one, because it's not something you can change after you've created the entity. Okay, if you really, really want to change it, you'll have to delete it and start again. Yeah.
Thank you.
Does that help?
Thank you. Yeah. Yes.
Okay.
Hey, Feridun, just to let you know that one person put in the chat that they'd used the hierarchical security in a large bank.
Oh, fantastic.
Yeah, so it's Richard. It's not sure if you can hear me, but yeah, used it in a couple of large banks where we had some extremely complex security modeling required.
Yes, yes. Oh, users love coming up with weird scenarios. Yeah. I mean, the really difficult ones are where they say, I need everyone to see this record except a set of people. And that's
the exceptions are always the killer, right?
Yeah. So I think if you can cover, 80 to 90% of what's needed, I don't know. It's really quite hard sometimes. Yeah. So if the hierarchy has got some options in the advanced find to help you find records that there, as you can see. Right. So so the next few slides speak to that question which I just answered. So the entity ownership. So it can either be user or team. Okay, that literally is the phrase, and that gives you all 5 levels. But if you really, really know that you don't care about ownership, then go with organization, because it simplifies things a bit. There's no owner field, you can't assign, and there's only 2 levels. So there, yeah, and that's just repeating what I said. One thing to watch out for if you're new to all this is with activity entities, then unfortunately you can't secure emails, for example, differently from appointments, because they are covered by one entity called activity, and that will apply to all of them, including any custom entities that you create as activity entities. Okay. Right, so I was trying to show you something, but my other window is not behaving. Oh, here we go. Yeah, so if we go to core records, and there's activity, you see that covers anything that's an activity entity, email, fax, whatever. Okay. Right, okay. If you create your own entities, then they will appear on the custom entities tab, and the default behavior is that only the system administrator and system customizer roles can see them. All other users will have no privileges whatsoever until you configure it for them. And something that's annoying in this interface is that there are lots of things that come from Microsoft in additional solutions that count as custom entities. So finding my custom entities in this long list of Microsoft ones is a little bit tricky, but there you go. Right, field security. So a security role gives you access. If it gives you access, it gives you to all the fields in a row, in a record. Whereas if you wanted to secure a specific field, then you need to resort to field security. And field security applies at the platform. So no matter how the user tries to get the data out, field security will work. I suppose the only exception is if it's on premises and they're also the SQL database administrator, they can go and look at the underlying table. But I guess that's cheating. So you can secure system fields, custom fields. You need to switch it on as a customizer in the definition of the field in a solution for the entity. And then you have to create some field security profiles. This is what was happening. Nothing was happening a moment ago. Let me just... Oh dear, that's not working. Okay, so we would click here, and I should get to see a list of security profiles. And then you would have to say in that profile what privileges you're going to allow. And the thing about a field security profile, it lists every secured field. So you will have to probably create multiple profiles if you want different people to have different sets of privileges on secured fields. So some of the things that you have to think about would be, there's my pic. I haven't got a picture. No, I don't have a picture. The things that you need to think about is, can the person make changes to the field? Can they view the field? And are they allowed to put in a value into the field when they're creating a record? So they are the three privileges in a field security profile that you have to think about. Okay. And the permissions that you give are independent of each other. So you might allow someone to update a field, but not allow them to see it. So possibly a credit card field. I mean, you probably shouldn't be storing credit card numbers in Dynamics anyway, but if you had a credit card field, you could allow a person to open a contacts record, not view the credit card field, but they might be allowed to change it. As long as they made sure they entered it correctly. And then as soon as they've saved it, of course, they then can't see it. Now, combining all of these things, you can't, field security profile can't override a security role. So if the security role doesn't let you do something, then forget the field security profile. And similarly, if a security role lets you do something, then the field security profile can come into play, but it then might stop you if it's not allowing you to make the change to the field, whereas the security role might be saying you are allowed to change the record. So there are two hurdles to get through. Okay, that's what that's saying. That kind of summarizes it as well. Okay. I'm kind of running out of time here, so let's talk a little bit about access teams, and I'll just talk through this lot fairly quickly. One of the things about sharing is that it might be a bit tricky for users when they do the share of a record, because if they click share here and they have to do this, and then they have to find the user, and then they have to click that, and then they have to decide which privilege should I give them, and it's all a bit much. So one thing that you can set up is to use access teams, and I like to call it automatic sharing. So what the customizer needs to do is to put a special grid on the form, so it just looks like a list of records, and all the user has to do to share is just add the user into that grid. So they'd open up a record, look at the grid and say, oh, they're the people I'm sharing with, and just add someone in. And what Dynamics will do behind the scenes is create a team just for that record, add the people that have been shared to into that team, and do the sharing according to something called an access team template. And I'll bring this across, but I'm slightly worried it's not going to work given what happened a moment ago. So here are my access team. Oh, that is working. Excellent. Template. So there is an out-of-the-box one for the opportunity entity. And then on that template, you go and define the privileges that will be granted when somebody does this automatic sharing, as it were, by popping someone into the team or taking them out. Okay, so the user is no longer concerned with what privileges to select. You as the administrator have decided what they should be. You can have multiple templates for the same entity. All you need to do is when you add the grid onto the form, you have to decide which template to use. And let me just get to the slide where, yeah, this is what you need to find. So when you're putting the grid onto the form, you must select all record types and look for this one, associated, excuse me, associated record team members. That's the view that you're looking for. And then the template that you have previously set up. So this was for account, and the team template was called account collaboration. Okay, right. Very, very quickly, business process flows in terms of security. So business process flows, if you create one, they confused myself. So out of the box entities and all custom entities can use business process flows. You have to switch it on the entity. And what happens then is that another entity is created for that business process flow. And one of the things that you can do with that is perhaps use field security as a way of stopping somebody going from one stage to another. You need an approval. Okay, and that's something that you can do. And because the business process flow is in itself an entity, then you can restrict who those business process flows are shown to by using security roles. Okay, that's something else you can do. And then there's some stuff there. They will show up in their own tab in the security role. So there is business process flows. Here they all are. And I guess a lot of the time you're probably going to want everyone to see them all. But you know what you might say is this role isn't going to have access to this my business process flow here. So that's another thing. Forms and dashboards, super quickly. If you have multiple forms to show different layouts to different departments, the user can choose the form they use, but you can use security roles to determine which forms users can select, and you may even restrict them to just the once. It's not really a form of security, it's more a user interface presentation thing, and all you need to do is on the form, look for this command, enable security roles, and then you can choose which roles will have visibility of a particular form. Okay, and this is where you might have a role just to use for forms and not select anything in it. Just give it a name that says, you know, access to Department X form, put people in that role. Doesn't give them any particular privileges, but it does allow them access to a form. Okay, so you can do the same thing with dashboards. And that is, I think, kind of summarizing some of the things I said at the beginning to do with, yeah, because it's a big topic.
Yeah, you've done incredibly well, Feridun.
I know, but I would like to have done more demos because, you know, this is aimed at people that are new to this, and I would like to have shown more, but I was conscious of the timing.
Yeah, what I suggest is, are you staying around till the end, Feridun?
No, I'm going to go in the next 20 minutes or so, I'm afraid. Right. I'm sorry, but I'm happy.
If anybody has got any questions, quickly, we'll try and cover them off then.
Feridun, have you got your contact details you could put up there?
Yeah. Let me just
machine.
Let me just go to the very beginning, and we can. There he is.
Perfect.
Feridun, there was a question.
Yeah.
Do you have any comments on the newer environment maker role?
That's more to do with stuff outside of Dynamics 365 and not to do with access to records and things inside. Yeah. Well, I mean, is there more to the question than?
Well, I just raised it because it was fairly recently that I noticed that I'd popped into our list of system roles. I wondered if you knew when it was being used or who was using that.
I think it's to do with controlling who can create apps and so on, unless someone knows better. I mean, it's all. I mean, a good place to look for all this stuff is, of course, docs.microsoft.com.
Yeah.
Go there and look for the this one here. There's tons of stuff there. Yeah. I mean, there are some other roles within a tenant to do with Dynamics as well, but they're more to do with management of the instance. So yeah, I wasn't really covering those things because I was more concerned with the inside and access to data.
But yes, need another session to do it.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, for example, one of the things where you will need an external privilege is when you add a user, and if you're using Exchange Online, you have to approve the email address on their mailbox. Just being system administrator is not enough for that. You have to have a privilege in the tenant. It doesn't have to be global admin. I think there are a couple of others that would work in order to do that. So yeah, security appears everywhere. Anything else from anyone?
Feridun, thank you. I think we're going to wrap up there, but just to mention that we're going to share the slides afterwards.
Yes, please.
Is that right? Yeah. So we'll
you've
post those on the user group
got
website
them from before. They're on the London one. I don't know if you want to duplicate them to anywhere.
Yeah, we'll do that. That's no problem at all. So we'll put them on the UG website. Tomorrow, I imagine. But no, just thank you very much.
Okay, you're all welcome.
Great session.
Thank you.
Yeah. Well done to cram a topic into the limited time.
Well, that's in my course training, that would probably be half a day or more with exercises.
Could we unmute and clap for Feridun?
Yes.
Yes, clap for
Great
Feridun.
idea. If everyone wants to unmute.
Oh,
Thank you, Feridun.
I'm flattered. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you,
Great.
Feridun. Thank you very much.
Right, I'm